Few people have influenced the day-to-day management of people and companies more than Ken Blanchard. Ken is a prominent speaker, business consultant, and author. His most successful book, The 1 Minute Manager, has sold over 15 million copies. In the early 1990s, Ken wrote Lead Like Jesus, where he looked at leadership strategies through the lens of Jesus Christ. When comparing his knowledge of leadership to the Gospels, Ken discovered Christ to be the greatest leader who has ever lived. I recently sat down with Ken to talk about leadership, Christ, and our responsibility as Christians to impact the world. First of all, thanks for doing this. When did you first start looking at leadership principles? When did you first start to discover that there were traits and characteristics that helped people lead well?
Well, I think it went all the way back to elementary school. I had a very interesting upbringing. I grew up in New Rochelle, New York, and I went to a 95% Jewish elementary school. On Jewish holidays, they put us all in one room, and they laughed and they said I was, retired the Goy of the Month award, and I won all the elections as the compromise candidate. And I remember I won the president of seventh grade, and I came home and told my dad. My dad was a naval officer. He had grown up at West Point, and so when I was elected president of seventh grade, I came home and I told my dad, and he said, "Congratulations, Ken, but now that you're president, your leadership training begins, because just because you're president, don't use your position. Great leaders are great because people respect and trust them, not because they have power." And then when I went to Cornell, it was natural for me to decide to major in government and political science with a minor in philosophy. And so I really, pursued leadership all the way from the beginning.
As you started to explore leadership principles, you wrote a book called 1 Minute Manager. When did you start to realize the impact, the influence that a book like that would have on leadership styles and helping people lead well?
Well, it was interesting is that when I was in graduate school getting my PhD, my faculty said, if you want to be at a university, you should be an administrator because you can't write, and because if you don't write articles and all as a faculty member, you perish. So I started off as an administrator, assistant to the dean of the College of Business at Ohio University. 1980, I was invited to a cocktail party for authors in San Diego by Adelaide Bree. She wrote Visualizations, Directing the Movies of Your Mind. And I got invited because I had this textbook. And so Spencer Johnson was there, and he had written a whole bunch of children's books with his wife called Value Tales. The Value of Courage, the story of Jackie Robinson. Value of Determination, the story of Helen Keller. So Margie Ann carried him over and said, "You guys ought to write a children's book for managers. They won't read anything else." And Spencer was working on a 1-minute scolding with a psychiatrist. And I invited him to a seminar I was doing the next week, and he sat in the back and laughed and all came running up at the end and said, "To hell with parenting, let's do the 1-minute manager." And so since he was a children's book writer and I'm a storyteller, we decided to do a parable. And he had the 1-minute scolding, which became our 1-minute reprimand. And I always said all good performance starts with clear goals and 1-minute goal setting. And then the key to developing people is to wander around and catch them doing something right and give them a 1-minute praising. So that's how we ended up writing that book. And we ended up on the Today Show on Labor Day, 1982, and interviewed on there. And the book went on the bestseller list the next week and stayed there for 2 or 3 years.
When did you first start to realize that you wanted to look at leadership principles through the lens of Christ? What role did Christ play in your life at that time, and how did you want to apply the leadership principles you'd been teaching through the lens and the modeling of Jesus Christ?
Well, in the popularity of the 1-minute manager, I got invited to be on the Hour of Power with Robert Schuller in his heyday at the Crystal Cathedral. And Schuller said, "Ken, I love the 1-minute manager, but you know who's the greatest 1-minute manager of all time?" I said, "Who's that?" He said, "Jesus." I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah. He was really clear on goals. Isn't that your first secret 1-minute goal setting?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "You and Tom Peters didn't invent management by wandering around. Jesus did. He wanted one from one little village to another village. If anybody showed an interest, he'd praise him, heal him. Isn't that your second secret 1 minute praising? Yeah. And if people stepped out of line, he wasn't afraid to give them a 1 minute reprimand. He threw the moneylenders out of the temple. Isn't that your third secret? He said, so he was the greatest 1 minute manager of all time. And so I kind of grew up in a Christian family, but kind of drifted away and all. But after being on Shula's show with that, I went and started to read the 4 Gospels and started to laugh, because everything I had ever taught about leadership, Jesus did with these 12 incompetent guys he hired. I mean, you wouldn't have hired that a lot, you know. I mean, it takes situational leadership. I mean, the first commission, he tells them where to go, where to stay, what to do if they do this, dust off your feet and all. And you see him go from directing to coaching to supporting. In the end of Matthew, he says, go and make disciples and baptize them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And that's all the direction he gives, you know, pure delegation. I got fascinated about it, and I realized that working with my friend Phil Hodges, who I'd met as a freshman at Cornell on the bus going to orientation camp, and he had become a big believer, and he had come down to see me, and he said, Ken, why do you think this book is so successful? And that was when I said, Phil, I don't know, God must be involved. And he said, oh, thank God, you know. And then I met Bob Buford through the Young Presidents Organization, and he had talked about moving from success to significance and all that kind of thing. And so it became really clear to me that Jesus practiced and taught all the things that we had been teaching. And he was the greatest leader of all times. But it was interesting, at that time, nobody was talking much about Jesus as a leader. You know, there was a great preacher, and he was the Son of God, and all those kind of things. But when you think about it, you know, here he took these 12 incompetent guys, you know, I mean, you wouldn't have hired that lot, and trained them and then sent them off to give their lives off for the ministry and spread the word.
What did Jesus have to say about leadership? When we talked on the phone, you talked about Jesus didn't come here to start a religion. He came here to establish relationships. What, in your explanation of this, what did Jesus have to say about relationships?
Well, I think Jesus really, his whole philosophy was based around love. And he said, you know, when they said, you know, what are the main commandments, you know, these 10 are too many. And he said, you know, love God with all your heart and all your mind, and love thy neighbor as thyself. And I think that's his whole philosophy of leadership. And so I really said that, particularly servant leadership, which he was a classic example, is love in action. You know, I mean, because in the Last Supper, when he got up, you know, and he said to them, you know, basically, you know, I'm going to be gone and all, but here's what I want you to do. And then he gets down on his knees and washes their feet. You mean, that's the ultimate servant leadership. I mean, how many people, you know, do that? So he said to them, even I have come to serve, not to be served. And so he modeled servant leadership all the way till the end, really.
And Jesus wasn't Christian. I mean, he wasn't here to start a religion. He was here to love people. Tell me more about that.
I mean, a lot of people don't know that Christianity is never mentioned in the 4 Gospels. And it's mentioned a few times in Acts, but it's negative, those damn Christians. And Jesus, I don't think, came to start a religion. I think he came here to build a relationship. And it was man that created this religion around them. And so I'm really a follower of Jesus, not a Christian. And I think that if we would remember to follow him and his philosophy and the way he treated people and all, the world would be a whole different place. But the minute you box them into a religion, and then they start saying, well, but you got this rule and that rule and all of those kind of things, then you're really in trouble. And Jesus' only rule was to love thy neighbor. You love God with all your heart and all your mind, and love thy neighbor as thyself.
You talk about the disciples, you know, the staff that Jesus had. You know, the disciples worked for free. Many of them died for the mission and vision that Jesus had instilled in them. What role did the disciples play in the mission and the leadership of Jesus?
Well, you know, when he started to gather them up, he said, come and follow me, and I'll make you fishers of men, not fishermen. fishers of men, and he trained them to go out and spread the word of love and compassion and all those things, And if you look at the whole love passage, love is patient, love is kind, love is, that's really the whole philosophy that they taught, and they were willing to give their life for the vision. And when people say, you say really Jesus is the greatest leadership role model of all time, I said, well, how many of you have people that work for you that are willing to die for your vision and all? It's not too many.
And what's our role as Christians? What's our role today to drop our nets and follow Jesus like they did 2,000 years ago? What's our role as Christians? What's our responsibility? What's our opportunity to impact the world?
Well, my whole philosophy is that the best way to help bring people to Jesus is not proclamation, but demonstration. And I think that what we need to do is follow his whole philosophy of dealing with people. And then people will come to you and say, I've been watching you and all. Where does all that come from? I mean, you're so kind. You listen to people. And then you can tell them where it came from, And so it's demonstration, not proclamation.
How do you think people want to be led? In one of your books, you wrote, people who feel good about themselves produce good results. But then recently, you adjusted it to people who produce good results feel good about themselves. How do leaders need to lead in order to motivate people? How do they want to be led?
It's interesting. A lot of people look at organizations and they said, the reason to be in business is to make profit. No, profit is the applause you get for creating a motivating environment for your people so they'll take good care of your customers, and then they'll become raving fans of your organization, and that takes care of the bottom line and the profit. Is that the focus is on your people, and that's what leadership is all about, and it's a both results and people, because you want to get things done, but you also want to realize that you get it done through your people.
What kind of difference can it make when a leader models his leadership style after Christ? Christ talked all about the future. He talked about life purpose, mission, and vision. What kind of difference do you think it makes if a leader chooses to make his leadership style model that of Christ?
Well, then what they do is they become servant leaders. And a lot of times when I talk about servant leadership, people think I'm talking about the inmates running the prison or trying to please everybody or some religious movement. No, there's two parts of servant leadership. There's vision, direction, values, and goals. And that's the leadership part of servant leadership. And that comes from the hierarchy. It doesn't mean you don't involve your people, but it's the responsibility of the leader in the hierarchy to make sure people are clear on what they're being asked to do and what good behavior looks like. You don't jam it on it, you do it with them. But once that's clear, then you philosophically turn the pyramid upside down. This is what Jesus did when he washed the feet of the disciples. You turn the pyramid upside down, and now you work for them. Your job is to help them win. And that's where the real action is. And when people realize that you got their back, that you're in their corner and all, then they'll do anything to help and all, because they realize that they're about a team. Leadership is about we, not me. And I think a lot of times that people really felt. And I think that's what Jesus was saying to his disciples. I really need you. It's about we, not me, because I'm not going to be here forever. And you need to pass the word around and create disciples and spread the word.
Let's talk about servant leadership. We live in a world where it just seems like everybody's in it for themselves. Where does servant leadership fit into the world today?
Well, it's really interesting. People ask me, well, who really practices servant leadership? And I say, well, the best organizations in all. I wrote a book with Colleen Barrett, took over presidency of Southwest. Now, they had this problem with the technology recently, but they're an incredible human organization. Nordstrom's, in retail, Wegmans in the grocery business, Sonova and financial services, Chick-fil-A and in the fast food area. They're all companies that basically lead with a servant leadership philosophy, because they really believe that you need to first make sure that everybody knows what business they're in, what the picture of the future is, what are we trying to accomplish, what are the values that should drive our journey, and now we can set some goals. And once those clear, now we turn the pyramid upside down and we basically work for them.
I read that during a time in your life you were an instructor at university, you were a professor, and you said that you gave the final exam on day one and then spent the rest of the semester teaching people to succeed. Tell me a little bit about that. What was your motive in giving people the final exam on day one?
Well, what really drove me crazy when I got working in my doctorate and all is to see how classes and all were set up with a normal distribution curve, where a few people win, a few people lose, and the rest are in the middle. And I started going around and saying to people, how many of you go out and hire losers? We lost some of our best people the worst people from last year. We need to hire some new leaders, losers to fill the low slots. And the reality is that you hire winners, and why don't you want to keep them winners? And so rather than trying to have a normal distribution curve, how do you help everybody win? And so I started to, in the beginning of class, give out the final examination. And the faculty would say, what are you doing? And I'd say, I'm confused. They say, you acted. I said, I thought we're supposed to teach these kids. You are, but don't give them the questions in the final. And I'd say, not only am I going to give them the final, what do you think I'm going to do all semester? I'm going to teach them the answers so they get an A. Life's all about getting A's, not some stupid normal distribution curve. And so they didn't really kind of get too excited about that and all. We started a master's degree program at the University of San Diego in leadership because I looked at all the MBA programs, and they maybe have put leadership studies in a course in organizational behavior, but it's mainly around finance and accounting and marketing and all. And so we started one where I believe that effective leadership is a transformational journey starting from self-leadership. You've got to find out who you are. Are you here to serve or be served, and then once that's really clear, then you take a look at the head, which is what are your beliefs about leadership, and we feel it's about servant leadership and the two aspects, and then the hands is how do you make it happen, And it's interesting, in our first class that we had at the University of San Diego, Gary Ridge was in it, and he had just come from Australia and took over as the president of WD-40, and he got excited about giving people the final examination. And he said, why don't we do that in organizations? And so he created a whole thing at WD-40. In fact, we wrote a book together about it called Help People Win at Work. And the subtitle was a business philosophy called Don't Mark My Paper, Help Me Get an A. And at WD-40, they would sit with each of their people at the beginning, and they would set goals and objectives and all. And then there was the job of the manager, because there's three parts of managing performance: performance planning, day-to-day coaching, and performance evaluation. And when you talk to most people and say, of those three things, where do you spend the most time? And they'll usually say evaluation, because they're filling out all these forms and all that kind of thing. And where the real action ought to be on the day-to-day coaching, which is once you agree on goals and objectives, how do you help people get an A? How do you help them accomplish their goals? And that really became the whole philosophy of leadership. And Jesus didn't want people to lose. He wanted everybody to win.
Do you have to be a leader to make a difference, or does everybody have an opportunity and really a responsibility to make a difference?
Well, my philosophy is everybody's a leader, because leadership is an influence process. Anytime you attempt to influence the behavior of somebody else, you're engaging in leadership, whether you're as a parent with your kids, as a spouse in your marriage, as a friend, as a colleague at work. So we're all leaders, and the question is, as leaders, how do we help people win? The power of the one-minute manager is once goals are clear, then what you do is you wander around and you see if you can catch people doing something right and give them a praising. And if they're not doing right, we wrote the new 1 Minute Manager recently. We changed 1 minute reprimand to 1 minute redirection because it's much more participative than a reprimand. Sounds like I'm coming down on you. But if you come to somebody and you say, gee, I noticed your performance in this area isn't as good as we had hoped. Do you agree? And they'll always agree, well, what can I do to help you get back on course? I'm here for you.
How has the world changed since you first wrote Lead Like Jesus? Is it still relevant today? Or is it maybe even more relevant today with everything that's going on in the world?
I think it's even more important today. I think we've gotten into much more of a win-lose philosophy about things. I mean, look at Washington. They're not in there to solve problems. They're to put their opposing party down. I got to speak one time a few years ago to Republicans, My first thing was, where's Jesus in this whole thing? Here you are in a pissing contest with your opponents. Why don't you look at the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and come up with a new vision for our country, and then go to the Democrats and say, here's our best shot of what we need to be accomplishing and see what they can come up with. And then once you agree on that, then, how do you help each other win?
What do you think the greatest challenge is today? What's the greatest challenge facing Christian leadership?
I think the greatest challenge is to be consistent with your beliefs and not to fold under pressure and get into believing that it's the bottom line that's the only thing that's important. You got to realize that if we lead like Jesus, we can get both great results and great relationships, because it's not just about relationships. You want to accomplish things. That's why the leadership part of servant leadership is really important.
I mean, there are a lot of people of influence who honor God on Sunday. They lead their families well. They're elders of some of the largest churches in North America, but at 8 o'clock Monday morning, their business is still their business. What would you say to encourage them to start weaving some of their faith into their Monday through Friday?
Well, I think we need to encourage them to take Jesus out of the church and into their lives. It's been exciting when we started the Lead Like Jesus ministry. People went, whoa, that's really interesting, because they hadn't thought about Jesus as a leader. We're with our ministry, we're not trying to convert people to the faith. What we're trying to do is get them to have a different model of leadership. And when they start to behave like Jesus, that's when you get people to actually go to change their faith too. But it starts with following his example of leadership and how he treated people.
If you were to write one more chapter to Lead Like Jesus, what would it be?
I would probably call it Do It Now. Yeah, do it now, because, I think it's an opportunity to really make a difference. People need this in the world.
What's your hope? What's your hope for Christian leaders? What's your hope for Christian leaders who are learning to lead differently? What's the possibility? Where could this go? What's your hope for these kinds of initiatives?
Well, my hope is that we could spread the word all around the world. If we would realize that we have the greatest leadership role model in our realm, and how can we spread that? And it's not to put other people down, but it's to say, here's the way to lead, here's the way to love, here's the way to be.
Thanks for doing this, Ken. We appreciate you sharing like this with our audience. Thank you.